Well, thank you, Mr. Chapman. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see all of you here today. It doesn't seem to matter how many people we have. The front is always open. The front rows are always empty. That's okay. You know, the coronavirus, or specifically the COVID-19 virus that we're all experiencing right now, was declared to be a pandemic by the World Health Organization on March 11th of this year. Well, what is a pandemic? I think we're more familiar with the word epidemic. An epidemic is a disease outbreak that affects a large number of people within a community, within a population, or within a specific region. Not very long ago, there was an outbreak of Ebola, which took place in a few of the countries in a particular region of Africa. That was an epidemic. A few countries, or in particular of this region of Africa, have suffered this epidemic. But a pandemic is a disease outbreak that spreads across countries and continents, and it affects more people, and it takes more lives than an epidemic actually does. Now, COVID-19 was an epidemic when it was contained in Wuhan, China. But now that it has spread worldwide, it is a pandemic. You know, the potential for the coronavirus to affect everyone on Earth is very much real, or is very real. That effect, or that potential, it does have a strong impact on every one of us in one way or another. For nearly 6 months now, we find ourselves doing things differently than we used to do. Some have been laid off from work or actually lost their jobs altogether. And even those who have continued to work or actually resumed employment go about their jobs very differently than they used to. It has affected where we are able to go and what we're able to do. Some of the effects on us are very minor. They're minor inconveniences, but for others, it has caused some very severe hardships and significant changes to their lifestyle. Well, certainly, getting the virus would have the greatest impact on any one of us individually. But all of these other factors related to the virus can take a cumulative effect, or have an accumulated toll on each and every one of us. So in what way has the virus, had the greatest impact on you? How has it affected you the most? Is it the limitations of not being able to go where you want to go, when you want to go? Maybe it's the simple increase of the time that you have to spend at home, and you're not able to have that social contact that you actually need and that you've been used to. Is it having certain stores or businesses that you often frequented no longer being open, or at least open up with a restricted accessibility? Is it a favorite restaurant that you used to go to and to enjoy a very peaceful and relaxing meal that's now closed? Or maybe it's the scarcity of some of the essential items that you like to have or that you need to live. You know, things like food, various food items or cleaning supplies, or that infamous toilet paper that you can no longer find. Maybe what affects you the most is the simplest things like mandated mask wearing. Any and all of these situations impact all of us, can have a very big impact on all of us in the way we live our lives. But the questions that we have to keep in mind, or that we have to ask ourselves, are: how are we handling these things? What are we learning? How are we coping? It's important that we think about what effect all of these things have upon us so that we can deal with them in the right way. Do you feel frustrated? Do you feel disappointed, impatient, fearful, or anxious about not being able to return to your normal way of life? If we look at those things, those feelings that I just mentioned, and we try to evaluate them as a whole, we might say that we are affected in these ways because we are experiencing a lack of contentment or a lack of satisfaction in our lives. And that's due, of course, to the changes that we've been forced to live with. So for the sermonette here this afternoon, we will see that learning to be content is a very important lesson for the times that we live in. The title of the sermonette I've given the sermonette today is A Life Lesson from Paul. A life lesson from Paul. Well, first of all, let's be reminded of where a lack of contentment can lead us. We find many examples recorded for us, or are recorded of those in the Bible, of those who were not content with the situations or the positions that they were given, or that they actually found themselves in. Adam was placed in paradise, but he wasn't content. He lived in a perfect environment, but he wanted more. He and Eve were enticed to take of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and as a result, they signed or they received the death sentence. We go back to the book of Esther. We're familiar with the character by the name of Haman. He had a very high position. He was a court favorite under the rulership of King Ahasuerus. But he wasn't satisfied with the position he had and the responsibilities that he had before him. He wanted more, and that led to his death as well. Even King Solomon, with unparalleled wealth and tremendous wisdom, seemed to always be seeking more. He always wanted more, acquiring more wealth, building more buildings. He always wanted more on a physical level. Just kept striving to have more and more. And then, of course, there's the nation of Israel, God's chosen people. God delivered them from slavery out of Egypt. He fed them, he clothed them, he protected them every day on their journey through the wilderness. He gave them a land flowing with milk and honey. He gave them cities that were already built. He gave them vineyards and crops that were already planted, just there waiting for them. Yet they always complained. They were never content. They wanted to go back to Egypt. They wanted to go back, or they longed for the good old days. They wanted those things that they were familiar with. They also were satisfied with God as their leader, as the ruler over them. And they wanted a king, a human king, like the other nations around them. They were just never satisfied with what they had been given. And then, of course, there was Lucifer, the great archangel, who was created in perfect beauty with all power and might. And he was given great responsibility. But he wasn't content. He wasn't content with what he had, and he became Satan, the adversary. He infected a third of the angels of heaven, all with that same attitude of wanting more, not being content, seeking something more than what they actually already had. So that we see why it's important that we learn to be content. From these examples, we see that there's a lack of contentment. That lack of contentment comes from a motivation of our human nature that is fueled by Satan, and that leads to death. It leads ultimately to death. So what do human beings usually strive for in life in order to feel content? I think in our world today that maybe the majority of humanity simply desires a place to live in peace and safety. But in general, man without God's guidance almost always seeks contentment by acquiring more things, more riches, more fame, anything to fulfill the desires of the flesh. This approach is a violation, of course, of the 10th commandment. You shall not covet anything that is your neighbor's. We often listen to Mr. Hampton, as I know others of you do as well. He conducts a Bible study a couple of times a month. I think he spent the last 5 Bible studies. Maybe he's covering the book of Psalm chapter 23. We're familiar with that. The Lord is my shepherd. He leads me by still waters and so forth. 5 Bible studies. We're just finished the second verse. You know, Mr. Hampton, that's his method of doing it. But he made a comment this past week in the Bible study that fits with this subject very well. He said that a lack of what we ought to do, what we lack when we're not content, and what we do is, as sheep who do not follow the shepherd very well, we wander, we stray off. And we often seek satisfaction in areas that are not profitable for us. Those things that ultimately lead to death, lead to sin and lead to death. So let's look at the Apostle Paul's comments on this subject, and let's look at the example that he set for us. An example that we all need to follow. If you would please turn to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 10. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 10. Here we find Paul is speaking of the material support that he had just received from the brethren at Philippi, or Philippi is sometimes pronounced. Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. It says, "But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last your care for me has flourished again, though you surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound here speaking from experience. We won't turn there, but we find in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he gives us there a long list of the trials that he suffered or experienced in his life since his conversion. He talks about beatings, about being shipwrecked, about being hungry. He talks about persecutions, of having to flee for his life, of imprisonments. And of course, he talks about the ongoing health issues that he had to live with his entire life. Paul knew what it was to suffer, to have needs, but he also knew what it was to experience blessings and abundance. Both extremes present unique challenges to our human nature, challenges that we must overcome. Matthew Henry's commentary makes a comment on this verse. It says, the temptations of fullness and prosperity are not less than afflictions and wants. Now, the book of Proverbs addresses this subject as well. It talks about this middle-of-the-road path that we must learn to walk on. But we're going to stay here in Philippians 4, but let me read to you Proverbs chapter 30, verses 7 through 9. Proverbs 30, verses 7 through 9. This is from the book of wisdom. 2 things I request of you. Deprive me not before I die. Remove falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food allotted to me, lest I be full and deny you, and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. So we see the need, how important it is for us to be content with what we have and where we are at in life. Paul says he learned to be content in all situations. To learn means to come to understand. He came to understand that accepting and making the most of his current situation brought a level of peace and satisfaction in his life. He didn't have to be anxious, fretting over what he couldn't do anything about at the moment. There in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, in the modern translations, it says, Paul says, I have learned the secret of being content in both good and bad situations. And then in verse 13, which I did not read before, it tells us how he does this. He says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Paul completely put his trust in God in every situation that he was in. He knew again by experience that it was not possible to endure these things on his own. He needed God's help. He knew that God would be there for him and with him. We also need the strength of God's Spirit guiding us, so that we become more Christ-like, so that we can learn to be content when we find ourselves in different situations. This was the lesson Paul thought was very important. It was a lesson that he passed on to Timothy, a young minister. But he not only passed it on to Timothy, it's recorded for all of us, all who God would call and begin to work with through time. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6. Paul is here warning Timothy about those who turn to religion and exploit it for financial gain. That through false teachings and wrong motives, they seek to gain wealth and so forth from turning to religion. But notice what Paul says about the source of the contentment. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 6. It says, now godliness with contentment is great gain. In verse 8 it says, and having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. And he goes on, of course, to the famous scripture that we've heard many times about money being the root of all kinds of evil. The point is, true contentment only comes through a right relationship with God. It only comes through a right relationship with God. For a final verse, let's turn to Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. Here it says, let your conduct be without covetousness. Again, there's that 10th commandment. Let it be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Here the author of Hebrews, who likely was Paul, again states the importance of learning to be content with what we have. Again, Matthew Henry's commentary makes this note on this particular verse. It's a comment that I think we can apply to ourselves today as we are going through the situation that we're going through right now. It says, what God gives us from day to day, we must be content with, even though it may fall short from what we have enjoyed in the past. And even though it may not come up to our expectations for the future, we must be content with our present lot. We have to bring our minds to our present condition. We have to live in the moment. We have to make the most of what we have. We have to allow this experience we're going through to allow it to draw us actually closer to God. So we are right now living under circumstances that none of us has ever faced before. Things are different, and yet we still have food and comfortable places to live. God has promised that He will never leave us nor forsake us, and to provide for all of our needs. He does give us everything, of course, that we need, just like He did ancient Israel. But the stakes for us are much higher, and the reward is much greater than that promised to Israel. The situation we find ourselves in today might indeed be compared to that very hot, dusty journey through the wilderness that Israel experienced. The world we live in today is certainly not a friendly place. Our goal, of course, is the kingdom of God, and even in the middle of a pandemic, we have the assurance that God has made available to us everything we need to reach that goal. If we view our current situation from that perspective, we should be content and very thankful.